Susan Hauser. I am the president-elect and also program chair for the 2016 Annual Convention, and I am here today interviewing a colleague and friend of mine, Jason Griffith. He is a PhD student and TA at Arizona, and he is also on the Middle Level Steering Committee. Jason, I wanted to start out by just talking a little bit or asking you a question about what you do when you are starting to write a proposal for a convention, some of the tips that you might give our viewers as to how you start that process.
Hi, Susan. Good to see you again, and thanks for taking the time to ask me these questions. So I'm happy to hopefully share some tips that will be useful to folks that are looking to create a proposal. So yeah, for my 12 years in the classroom, and even now as I start to start my own proposal process, I think the one question that I ask myself is, what am I most excited about in my classroom at that time? So when people ask, what are you doing at school? What are you working on? And that one idea that you're super excited about, Susan, you're probably the same way, and many of our colleagues probably are the same way, but I never really did things the same way more than once. Every year I might be tweaking a unit or a lesson or trying some new approach or trying some new text. And whatever it was that gave me the most excitement, that's kind of where I start. So kind of describing that approach and how I went about implementing it, and what was successful, what wasn't successful, and those are kind of the guts. Then I start to look for other folks that I know either in my district or through my writing project or my various networks that might have similar interests. Or I say, hey, here's what I'm working with. Do you have any ideas? And I start looking for connections that might make an interesting panel.
That's really a good idea. I liked what you were saying about you being excited about what you're doing in your classroom and then linking that to what other people that you know are doing. Do you have a certain process or planning process that you go through? Let's say you've got your idea and you've found a couple of people that have the same or have some input into what you're doing. Do you have a process of steps that you go through maybe to try to do the best proposal that you can?
I wouldn't say that I have a specific sequence of steps, but I think it's important to, especially if you're working with a panel of folks that you're putting together, a couple of colleagues, I think it's important to appoint one person as kind of the point person, and if they're writing it up in a Google Doc or some sort of collaborative doc that they're sharing, there has to be kind of one person to kind of take charge and designate the various portions. Since in the proposal you basically have the two major sections of the 50-word program annotation and then the 750-word description. So the program annotation being what, if it makes the program, your session makes the program, what attendees would see, and then the 750 words are all the different people and how they would present. So I think it's important for one kind of person, and maybe that ends up being the chair, or maybe that's just the person who submits the proposal, but kind of for one person to take charge of making sure that those parts are met and that everybody's voice is included.
Okay.
And usually that's helpful if there is one person that has some NCTE experience, that's a job that they can do, and then kind of bring in some folks that are new to the system that way. That's a good chance for local mentorship.
Those are great ideas. What about relating the proposal to the theme of convention? This year my theme is around advocacy, but every year we have a theme. How do you tie that piece into what you're doing as well?
Right. Well, I think that's the kind of the hallmark of a good convention theme is one that can include lots of different ideas, and kind of going back to that original question of what exciting is going on in your classroom. What I've often found is that working backwards by answering that question first, usually with a little bit of wordsmithing, and since we're English teachers, that should come easy, right? With a little bit of creative wordsmithing, we can usually find some way to fit that into the theme. And I think your theme this year of advocacy, Susan, is so it's a great example of that, because when we hear the term advocate or advocacy, I think right away my brain goes to kind of big names like a consumer advocate like Ralph Nader, or like an educational advocate like Jonathan Kozol. But I think in your call for proposals, reading down through that, if we look at the definition of advocacy and what an advocate is, we're all advocates for our students, we're all advocates for our profession, and I think looking at even those different approaches that we have in our classroom just to get kids excited and kind of empower them and turn them into their own advocates, there's so many different ways to include that we don't have to necessarily be someone who's making the news for various kind of big ticket forms of advocacy, but just different ways that we empower our students, different ways that we give our students voices, different ways that we find positive, proactive ways to get our voice into the field. All of that could be considered advocacy.
When you're writing the proposal, do you, after you've collaborated with people and you've done, kind of communicated all of that, do you feel like it's best for one person to do that? Or you mentioned a Google Doc. Is that a good way to go about doing it? I know that some people are not familiar with that technology or comfortable with it, but there is a way of doing that, and I just wondered if you like that process better.
Sure. So I've done it. Kind of a more old-fashioned way of just a Word document that we've shared and then everyone contributes to. And then for the past couple years, sending out the Google Doc, what's neat about it is everybody can kind of see the development and everyone can kind of edit it. So even though you might have a point person, it still gives the entire group that editing control, and you kind of can see if something accidentally gets cut out that you think is important. It gives everybody kind of that safety double check. So yeah, I definitely like the Google Doc approach if you're working with a couple people, which also makes it easy to work with folks who aren't in your immediate vicinity. You can work with folks from across the country.
Yes, we use it a lot with the EC and even with the presidential team of trying to get things together. So I know that it's a really good tool to use when you're trying to develop something. Do you have any questions for me, maybe, about the proposal process? I don't know if I'm turning this back around in case you had any questions.
I have to say I'm pretty excited. I definitely came up with some ideas right off the bat. What kinds of sessions are you most excited about seeing make the program this year?
Well, I put in the call for proposal. I was, looking for more of an open discussion between participants and presenters. And so the panel, the round table, those kinds of workshop events or sessions are the kinds that I'm really looking for, with people sharing more than just one perspective. And even though we've always done that in the past, I think it's very important to involve the participants in the workshop or in the session. And I'm going to try to do that in general sessions as well, so that people can ask questions or be as actively involved as they'd like to be.
I think that sounds great. I know for the past 2 years, having reviewed middle-level proposals, and last year also having coached some folks through them, I think that's one piece that's often missing from a good proposal. Oftentimes I'll see really well-written proposals, but the folks don't take time to talk about how they're actually going to use the time. So how you mentioned about kind of actively participating in the session, that's something that I always try to encourage you to do. So you have this 20 minutes or you have a panel of an hour. How are you going to engage participants? So especially considering that teachers who are used to being in front of the classroom are coming and they're not necessarily just going to sit there and listen to a PowerPoint or listen to kind of a presenter. So how are they going to be actively engaged? So I would encourage potential submitters to write that into the proposal. How will you make use of that time during your presentation?
I had one other question I wanted to ask you. How do you view actually doing a proposal as a professional development experience? How is that improve you as an educator and as a student now? You're going back and being a student, but you're a teacher as well. How does that help your professional development experience in coming to convention?
Sure. So our middle level chair, Matt Skillen, during one of our middle level meetings, I remember him encouraging us to consider the definition of the term convention. So if you look at that root, convene, different voices coming together, I see that as kind of a give and a take. There's elements of both giving and taking. We're English teachers, so again, going back to verbs, we're talking about both the passive and active. So I think if you come to NCTE as a passive observer, of course you're going to take a lot from the conference, but there's also the idea of providing an active role and bringing your voice, and I think that's one of the strengths of NCTE, is that a grassroots teacher with a really good idea that's working really well locally can be presenting in a session next to a big name person that's been recognized in a lot of books and a lot of forums, and actually contribute that as well. And then as you leave convention, besides actually just going with a lot of good ideas, you might actually go with a new partnership or something that I think doors open when you tend to present and put yourself out that way. I think you make connections that you don't if you're just presenting. So Susan, I'm not sure if you're familiar with rugby, but I was thinking about this. I think it's called a scrum, when the rugby players all come together and they're fighting for control of the ball and kind of pushing. And I think that when we present at a convention like NCTE, we join the scrum. So rather than just standing on the sidelines and watching the game, we actually can kind of have just a little bit of a push to kind of direct our field in a way, which I think is pretty neat, that an idea that we bring to convention might actually transform someone else's classroom.
Well, thanks a lot, Jason, for being with me this afternoon and for sharing some of your experiences. And hopefully I will hear from you and see you again soon and before convention. And I know you probably are a reviewer this year, so you'll be looking at some of these proposals. And thanks for taking your time this afternoon to help us explain this to other people.
Thanks so much, Susan. It was a pleasure to be here. I look forward to seeing you in Atlanta, if not before, and I definitely look forward to seeing some great proposals this year.
Okay. Bye, Jason.
Take care.